If you're watching this, you must have been just a little bit curious about what I meant by a reliable or an unreliable narrator. You will see more information about this down in the final creative essay information. But if you're interested in this for essay number 2, here's something fun. Every story is told from a point of view. Whether you watch a film, or whether you read a book, or whether you read a poem, or a screenplay, or anything you read, you are seeing the version of what the writer or the film creator or the poet wants you to see. There's a whole world around whatever focus that scene, that moment, that paragraph, that poem has in mind. The narrator or writer or film creator wants you to see one specific thing. And either they are giving you an accurate representation of what's going on, or they aren't. If they are, that's a reliable narrator. If they aren't, it's an unreliable narrator, which brings up a whole series of questions. Here's a story from my own life that I think is kind of interesting. I was married to a man who was a great guy. We had such a good time, and we'd known each other since we were 13. Well, we went on a trip to Jamaica. Now, if I told you about that trip to Jamaica as the narrator of the story, I would tell you how we went on a hot air balloon, how we had so much fun in the markets, how great the food was, how much fun it was to listen to the steel drum players on the beach. I would go into an entire narration of that trip. If you asked Mike to narrate the events of that trip, he would say he was miserable, he didn't have any good time, he didn't like a minute of it, he just wanted to go home. I did not know this until long after we were gone as a couple, and I said, you know, what about that Jamaica trip? And he had a completely different take on that trip than I did. Have you ever had that experience yourself? Have you ever talked to your siblings about something that happened and they remember it completely differently from how you remember it? Well, in fictional literature, actually in nonfiction, but we're going to keep it to fictional literature, when we have a narrator telling the story, we just finished Great Expectations, and Pip is a narrator. Is he telling the truth? Is he giving an accurate description of what's going on? Let's look at an example of one type of narrator. The narrator tells me the story of this young man and describes his unhappy childhood, how he's in trouble, how he's affiliated with problematic people, tells me the story about how he's getting into trouble, and gives me a perception of this young man that would indicate that this young man is troubled person and is getting ready to make a decision to do something, I don't know, whatever the narrator has decided. Now, is that an accurate representation of this person? Well, let's look at the whole world of the story. Here's what's really going on in the whole world of the story. He's performing, and the reason that he's grimacing is because he's looking into... So, is that a reliable narrator telling us that story, painting that picture of the young man with his words or with his images? No, he's an unreliable narrator. Now, that's in the best of situations, and the easiest way to explain an unreliable narrator. And that is one that's not giving the complete picture of the story. Here's one I've always thought I would want to do if I was going to write about reliable and unreliable narrators. Girl Interrupted. I know it's kind of a dated film, but I think it's a great opportunity for analysis. It's always intrigued me because the protagonist is telling the story from her point of view. And so the viewer in the audience, or the reader of the script, receives an interpretation of events based on this girl's point of view. Is that what really happened? Do her parents really behave that way, or is that just the way she sees them? And if the parents could narrate the same scene, what would they say happened? If the other characters narrate the scene, this girl is crafty. She is not quite the victim that she might pose herself to be. But as you can see, if I were going to analyze this narrator, I would approach the subject matter as though that narrator absolutely lived, and absolutely lived in real time in this world and did these things. And I can analyze from there. Now, I wrote an entire master's thesis on that includes elements about the narrator of the 18th century English literature film Tom Jones. And I can't imagine that you would want to read that essay, but I'll put a link to it just in case you get excited. But the main thing to remember with a narrator is that you inform yourself about whether that narrator is reliable or unreliable based on the events of the story, the film, the screenplay, whatever. If the narrator describes the character in one way and yet there is a different outcome, then was that narrator telling the complete truth? What else was going on in that scene? Or what other interpretations could be made by the characters? And all we have for the characters is what they say, do, and what is said about them. And the only way we know what they say, do, and what is said about them is whatever the narrator tells us. So it makes it kind of fun to take a look at a piece of literature or film and decide whether or not we're getting the whole full picture there. All right, so that's what an unreliable or reliable narrator in a nutshell. If you want to play with that, you can. There's all kinds of information online about narrators in fiction, and you can have a great time with that. That's enough for me on this. Play around with it if you like.